Hey guys, Brandon Adkins here, Elite Application Engineer with Quest Integration. And the topic for today is creating animations in the new SolidWorks 2016 PhotoView 360 with motion blur options. So I'll start with a couple of animations. We wanted to spice things up a little bit with our marketing images. So one of the ideas we had was to put all these logos that we use on basically a slot machine reel. Spin the things around and see what it looks like when we render that animation. You can see the first one that we're looking at, not all that interesting. Not too much going on. We can see things moving, but that's about it. Let's take a look at what we get if we use those new options with the PhotoView 360 motion blur. Much more interesting to look at. We get much more realistic representation of the items spinning around as we would expect. So it's definitely a great option to add some realism and some interest to the animations that you're creating. So let's jump into SolidWorks and I'll show you what it takes to set something like this up. So I modeled 3 parts. They're just basic wheels. I'll show you more detail here in just a moment. And then I applied decals to the faces where I wanted those logos to show up. A couple of tips and tricks to get started with this animation process. First thing that you might want to do is set up a saved view for your orientation. Really makes it easy as you're changing the model and setting up your animation to get back to that same view orientation every time. So you can hit your space bar and click to create a new view to help set it up for animation. Makes things easier in the long run. Also, I set my assembly up to use a plain white background. I wanted the focus to be on the labels, not on the background, not on the model itself. I want it to look like the labels are spinning without too much else going on. So another technique that I used to help with that was modifying the part appearances. If you look under your advanced options for illumination of those parts, I didn't want too much reflection of light or light emission from any of these components. So most importantly, you're going to want to set your reflection amount. If you don't want any light bouncing off these, set your reflection amount to 0. And then you can experiment with the other options like transparency, so on and so forth. Inside each one of these parts, I'll just take a look real quick at how to set up some of those labels. You could model this differently than what I did, but I've got just a bunch of pie wedge shapes here that will make it easy to apply the labels, but I could also change the number of instances to help set this up for different number of labels for other animations that I might do in the future. As I was getting started, I didn't have all of the images that I needed right off the bat, so I just used some of the preloaded decals in the SolidWorks interface. So go to your task pane, click on the decals section, and you can drag and drop those images onto your model. All we're going to do here is just change some of the mapping properties. So if you need to rotate the image, change the size, whatever you're interested in, it's up to you to make those changes. And once you're ready with the final images, you can always come back to that same decal. That's why I like starting with the preloaded decals, because I can just go back and change the image that I map to. So we're going to do that in this case. I'll go in and grab my new image. And then it's as simple as just changing the masking options. These images use a alpha channel background, so that'll help me to show just the decal and not the background associated with that image. Makes for a nice looking appearance for that decal. So that's about the setup of the parts. All I did then was just brought those into an assembly, mated them to a couple of axes to allow them some degrees of freedom to spin. Once you're done with that, now we can go to the Animator. So down on your Motion Study tab, you can use the standard animation properties. You can apply a motor to each one of these parts. In this case, I've got 2 that are spinning one direction, and the middle one is spinning the opposite direction. So you're just going to change the direction of rotation as necessary. For my animation, I set it up to use segments. So what I wanted to achieve was, for a particular amount of time, I want the model to sort of ramp up in velocity and then ramp back down to make it look more like a slot machine effect like we would expect. So you can do that just by entering displacement values. You could also set it up to use particular velocities or acceleration. Whatever's easiest for you, you can set those up accordingly. I just did mine with a standard displacement. And once you're ready to go, you can calculate your animation so we can see that spin motion happening. We can see the ramp up and down of the velocity. Nice quick setup. I can do that for the other two parts in the animation. Pretty straightforward as far as that goes. So we'll take a look at the rest of our setup here. I'm going to go ahead and hide those edges like I mentioned before. I've got all the motors applied in this final animation, so you can see things are just about ready to go. We can get into our rendering for that final video. Setup for that, pretty straightforward. First thing I want to do is make sure that I've got PhotoView 360 enabled. You'll have to have SolidWorks Professional or Premium to render this with motion blur. When you go to save your animation, you're going to choose SolidWorks PhotoView 360 as your rendering engine. I would also recommend to start with a relatively low resolution to begin with so that it doesn't take too much time to render. And once you're ready for it, you'll just check the motion blur option. So you've got two properties that you can configure: the motion blur length and the blur offset. So if you want more or less blur effect in your animation, you can experiment with those two options. And then it's a matter of choosing our number of frames per second, saving the animation. You're going to want to choose a compressor as you go through the video options. Typically I'll use the Microsoft Video 1 or just a full frames uncompressed, and you can use a third-party application later to compress it if you need to. When all is said and done, we can end up with a nice realistic looking animation with the new motion blur options. So hopefully you enjoyed this video and you learned a couple of new things. If you do have additional questions, feel free to leave us some comments below or check us out at www.qintegration.com. Thanks for watching.